Anchor Smokehouse Brewhouse. There's a few things I want to cover before I get this tour officially started. Well, normally I would have done that kind of roll call thing at the end, but my buddy's got to do some things later, so we got to do it kind of reverse order. But the first thing I want to cover is that this tour is going to last somewhere between an hour and a half. That really depends on you guys though, because there's a lot of stuff that we can cover as it pertains to beer. Like in beer, we do biology, there's chemistry, there's engineering involved. It's a very historical beverage. We've been making beer for a very long time, so we can talk about history. I can regale you guys with debaucherous tales from underneath the deck, or you guys can sit around and get drunk. It's really up to you. It's your tour, so you guys ask me questions, and that'll let me know which way y'all want to steer this thing. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
Now, some of those questions might be answered with we'll cover that in a few minutes, or I'll get there later. Just kind of try to bookmark those questions for me. That's because that just sort of makes sense. It makes more sense at a different portion of the tour. Does that make sense to all you guys? Cool. The last thing I want to make sure you guys are all aware of, just so that that everybody that is here wants to be here and nobody is here that doesn't want to be here. Because I also understand, even though you guys signed up via the Hub app, you're also on vacation, and sometimes people don't read stuff when they're on vacation. So I want to make sure you all understand that the tour is not free. It's $30 per person, unless you're on Cheers and you get a 25% discount, or on us, or any of those other packages. For that, what you're going to get is you're going to get to stare at me for the next hour. Yay! Everybody's supposed to clap there. Yay! And also, I'm going to literally feed you as much beer as you want to drink. Yay! If you want more beer, all you got to do is ask, and I will then bring you more beer. Sound good? Cool. The other thing I'm going to give you guys is a bunch of souvenirs at the end. Does that sound okay to everybody? All right, all minds being clear. Cool. So let's get this thing started. My name is Robert Lee Carter. I come from a very small town in North Florida called Keystone Heights. There's absolutely nothing in Keystone Heights except for meth heads and trailer parks. It's one of those little one-stop redneck towns in North Florida that you hear about on the news. There's nothing there but I told you, rednecks and trailer parks, a couple of farms. Obviously, I didn't start in craft beer there, so I moved to Lakeland, Florida about 10 years ago, and that's where I started in the craft brewing industry. There's a large craft contract facility in Lakeland called Brew Hub. And the business model at Brew Hub is that they make beer for everybody else. So think about it this way. This guy, what's your name? Sal. If Sal opens a brewery and he can no longer meet the public demand for the beer that he's been producing, he's got two options. He can either A, build a big new brewery with a whole bunch of new equipment and invest a whole bunch of new capital, or he can farm out his production to someplace else, and then he gets paid, and you get beer, and I get paid, and then everybody's happy. Does that make sense to you guys? Mm-hmm. You ever heard of Cigar City Brewing?
Yeah.
You ever heard of Green Man out of Asheville, North Carolina? Yeah. Or Toppling Goliath out of Decorah, Iowa? Or the Brewery out of Central California? Or you ever eaten out of BJ's Brewhouse?
Yeah.
All those places use Brew Hub for their production capacity beer. Then I went to Yingling for about a year. That was a soul-sucking, horrible production job. So I left it, and I went back to Brew Hub as the director of brewing operations. Now I make beer on a cruise ship. Yay!
Yay!
Any questions for me so far? Is there any brewers here? Brewer. All right, so aside from you guys, there are 4 raw materials that we usually use making beer. Does anybody know one of those 4 raw materials? Hops. I heard it first, so we'll talk about it first. So hops is a green pine cone looking thing. Well, at least that's how they occur in nature. Generally, there's somebody on the tour wearing a graphic tee with a hop on it, but apparently I failed today. But so they kind of look though sort of like this hibiscus flower. Oh no, that's a lily, right? Yeah. They kind of look like this. So they've got a bunch of leaves upon a cone, kind of like a pine cone or a lily or whatever. Now, we generally we call those whole cone hops. We don't usually use whole cone hops in production brewing, and that's because whole cone hops are fairly inefficient. Do you guys know anything about marijuana? The devil's lettuce, weed? No, I only have purely academic knowledge. But from what I understand, inside the bud that weed grows on, there's seeds and stems. Do we want the seeds and stems? No. But do we want the flower around the seeds and stems? Yes. In the same way, the hop cone has seeds and stems on the inside. We don't want that. So the manufacturer strips off all the flour, they send it to me in a pelletized format. These hop pellets that we're using, what we're using them for is to generate bitterness and aroma within the beer. Now there's lots of different aromatic compounds inside the hop that contribute to flavor and aromatics. And there are many different types of hops that we can change that varietal hop and so then change the way the beer tastes and smells. Every letter in the alphabet from like A, so like Amarillo, and Z, like Zeus, has at least one, if not multiple varietals associated with the letter. There's actually one varietal hop called the 7 C's. It's not the 7 C's, it's the 7 C's. Like Centennial, Cascade, Calypso, they blend 7 C's varieties together and they get the 7 C's variety of hops. There's another varietal hop called Citra. Can you guess maybe what Citra might smell like?
Citrus.
We don't get super creative when we name stuff in beer. If it smells like citrus, we call it citrus. Can you guess what color black malt is? Black. Brown malt is? Brown. Honey malt tastes like? Biscuit malt smells like? Are you tracking so far? Cool. So also I told you we get bitterness from the hops. Now there's something in the hops called isoalpha acid. And the higher the level of isoalpha acid, the more bitterness it will contribute to the beer. So the longer and the hotter I boil the alpha acid in the hop, the more bitter I can extract from the hop. You guys, is that all tracking so far? Cool. So what's another ingredient? Water. Water. I heard it, so we'll talk about it. Water is the unsung hero in almost all beverage. And when I say unsung hero, what I'm referring to is that, well, obviously it's fairly important to get liquid in a glass. I need to put water in it. Yes or no? Yes. I'm glad we're at least on that educational platform. Good job. Way to go. So that's obviously not the thing I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the minerals that are broken down into the water. So zinc, magnesium, calcium sulfate, calcium chloride, all these minerals, they hold on to different levels and different amounts of protein, different types of protein, and I therefore can change something we call mouthfeel. Can you guess what mouthfeel might be?
How things feel in your mouth.
It's the way it feels in your mouth. So again, we don't get real creative when we name stuff. What I mean by that, have you ever had a lager? Bud Light, Miller, whatever. You ever had a Guinness? A stout? Do they feel different on your palate? That's mouthfeel. The viscosity of that liquid is different, and it's different because the different minerals that are in the water hold on to different levels of different stuff, and therefore I can change that liquid's mouthfeel. Does that make sense to you guys? Now here on the ship, I am using that water to make beer from. The ship brings it in to cool the engines and all kinds of stuff, and then they desalinate it, they reverse osmosis it. I get it through my tap as a blank slate. There is 0 minerals broken down into that water because we've removed them all. And then I replace the minerals to build the water profile that I want to build for that particular beer. Now what I want you guys to understand though is that's not just because I'm on a cruise ship. Almost every brewery in the world will strip their water down to nothing and add back minerals because it's a whole lot easier for us to control what's in the water if I take everything out and I'll only add what I want back in. Does that make sense to all you guys? A lot of times people think that like brewers are just like sitting around drinking beer and it's like, oh. I mean, this is really just science. So like the more consistent I can make my experiment, the more consistent my product's going to be. So I need to control all the variables I have to control, and water is one of the biggest ones to control. Does that make sense to all you? Cool, awesome. What's another ingredient? We talk about hops, we talk about water. Yeast. Yeast is my favorite ingredient. Anybody know why?
Because it makes the alcohol.
Hello, say it louder for the rest of the class. Because it makes alcohol. If you guys can't guess, I'm kind of a fan of alcohol. Would you guys be here if I was selling you O'Doul's?
No.
Hell to the no, you sure wouldn't. Y'all want alcohol. So the way we produce alcohol is we feed something to a microorganism. In our case, in beer, that would be yeast. That yeast then metabolizes the sugar and then creates alcohol and CO2. The main thing for y'all to understand on this tour is that there's many different varieties of yeast. And we can change the different varietal of the yeast and how I treat that yeast, and therefore change the way that beer might smell or taste. You ever had a Hefeweizen? You ever had a lager? You ever had a IPA? You ever had a sour? All of those things are fermented using different types of microorganisms or different types of yeast, and therefore those beers taste and smell very different from one another. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. So, here's the last ingredient. What is it? Barley, or
Grain.
wheat, or malt, or rye, or corn, or rice. Any cereal grain you could name. Yay! Okay, here's the rule. Every time Damagoy walks out, this is Damagoy, by the way. He's a brewery assistant. Every time he walks out that door with a pitcher of beer, you have to clap for him. If you don't, you won't get any more beer. Okay, cool. He's going to bring more beer. So what I'm going to do with this right now is I'm going to demonstrate to you guys how to pour one beer. If you guys screw it up, it's your fault, not mine. So do not pour this beer into this paddle like this. That will make a big mess. Pick up your glass, tilt the glass, pour onto the tilt until you get about halfway. Then begin to untilt the glass until you have some nice frothy head on top and some beer down below. Sound good?
Yes.
Cool. I'm going to pass this pitcher around. You guys don't park on the ground. Yay, hallelujah. There goes my glasses. Here, you guys can have this one. Ladies first. Yeah, just pour, and then we'll pass, and then he'll bring out some more beer in just a second. Pump up fast. Yeah, I'll get it. Let me find my glasses.
They're right under here.
My ADHD won't let me go without a fidget spinner. Have you guys noticed I've been spinning these glasses the whole time? But it's my ADHD brain. I gotta be doing something or else I'll lose my mind. So we were talking about the last ingredient. What was the last ingredient? Wheat, barley, malt, hops. Now, in the brewing industry, we refer to this thing as malt. So I got you.
He's killing it, man.
He's got a job. He needs assistant.
Less hands, better hands. Steady hands.
Man, look at you, buddy.
No, man.
I'm so proud of you.
You had at least a drink today.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, sir.
By the way, that pitcher is slightly heavier than other pitchers. It's a 4-liter pitcher. So just, I don't know, maybe a big, strong person at the table take it over or something. You look like a viable candidate. Look at this guy on guns over here. All right, cool. So we're talking about barley. Now, in the brewing industry, we will refer to barley as, or the cereal grain as malt. And referring to it as malt because the maltster is going to take the grain and we're going to put it into a kiln. And the longer and the hotter that we bake the grain, the darker it becomes. Have you guys ever baked cookies?
Yes.
You ever made pancakes? You ever baked a cake? Baked anything. What's happening there is the longer and hotter you bake it for, the browner it becomes. Yes or no?
Yes.
That's because you're caramelizing the sugar into color. And the browner it gets, also the less sweet it tastes because you've caramelized the sugar into color. Does that make sense to you guys? The same thing happens with malt. So I told you guys black malt is black. That's because we've caramelized all of the sugar in that into color. So whenever I add black malt into a beer, I get a porter or a stout, a very dark color. But it doesn't give me very much sugar. And that sugar is very important. Does anybody know why the sugar is important?
Alcohol.
Because it creates alcohol. That is what the yeast ferment in order to create alcohol. Now, I could use anything to create sugar from, right? If I used honey, though, that would make
Mead.
If I use grapes, that makes
Wine.
If I use apples, that makes
Cider.
If I use dextrose, that makes White Claw. There's no color, there's no flavor, it's just sugar and water, therefore you get alcoholic water. Does that make sense to you guys? We brewers, we love White Claw. Do you know why? Because it's way cheaper to make and I can sell it to you for the same exact price. Profit margin on White Claw is extraordinary because there's no barley in it, there's no wheat in it, there's no hops in it. It's just water with simple sugar and then we flavor it with some, I don't know, pineapple and coconut. And then we get a pina colada White Claw and you guys will pay the same price for it. Make sense to y'all? Cool. Thank you, Anheuser-Busch, for inventing White Claw. Yeah. I appreciate that. So, by the way, this first beer we're drinking today, I'm talking about it now because they're almost at the end. The first beer we're going to drink today is the Beach Lager. We call it Beach Lager because it's a lager that you would drink on the beach. Got it? Now, later on, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something called DMS. So maybe save a little bit in the bottom of your glass so that you guys can smell something a little bit later. Sound good? This is our probably most approachable beer that we make on the ship, and it's also probably our most popular beer. That's because here I show all the sports. I mentioned that earlier, right? And when you guys are watching football or baseball or basketball or whatever, you probably want to be drinking light beer. Yes or no? Yes. That's why this is probably our most popular beer, because we show all the sports here and people just want to chug a chuggable beer. This is beer flavored beer, beer pong beer, college beer, flip cup beer, whatever you want to call it. There's nothing going on in this beer except for beer flavor. Cool? Awesome. You guys, would y'all be offended if I joined you?
Not at all.
Drink it out of the pitcher, bro.
I don't want to do that because then I gotta wash it before I give you more. And I'm sure you guys are gonna want more, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Ghibli, Prost, Nostrovia, Ching Ching, Salud, Ghibli. Anybody know another one?
Ziggy zaggy, ziggy zaggy.
Oi, oi, oi! Cheers, guys. And depending on my mood, this one is probably my favorite beer that we make on the ship. Now, when I say depending on my mood, what I mean is that I also really love our IPA, and I'll tell you why later. But I also really love this beer, and that's because I told you guys I'm from a very small little redneck town in the north of Florida, and I grew up drinking Natty Light. This is very nostalgic for me. Because there's nothing going on here but just regular beer flavor. Yes or no? Cool. Do you guys have any questions on the barley?
That's good.
Yes, any questions on malt, hops, water, yeast? Cool. So those four ingredients that we just mentioned, water, hops, malt, and yeast, that makes up something in Germany called the Reinheitsgebot. Now, the Reinheitsgebot is known as the German purity law. It was written like in the 14 to 1600s. And that means that Germans are only allowed to make beer using those four ingredients. Have you guys ever heard of, or you ever hung out or dealt with any Germans?
Yes.
Are they super flexible people?
No.
So when they say you're only allowed to use water, hops, malt, and yeast, they mean that. But Americans got our hands on beer, and we decided to do what we do best. We said, Katie, bar the door, if I want to put blueberries in my beer, by God, I will. If I want to put peanuts, hazelnuts, chocolate, habaneros, ghost pepper powder, you name it, some guy in America has put that crap in beer. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is here on this ship, we only use water, hops, malt, and yeast in our brewing process for the most part. And that's because here on the ship, I don't have the acquisition or storage capability that most people do. So here, I already have to have a plan written in some place to put water, hops, malt, and yeast, and I don't have any spot to put 300 gallons of blueberry puree. Does that make sense to you guys? I get this question a lot from the ladies. I'm not generalizing. I'm just saying that usually ladies ask me this question, and that is why we don't make like a cider or something like that. And that's because I don't have the storage capability to put 400 gallons of apple juice somewhere, and it's surely not going in my cabin. Does that make sense to y'all? Cool. So now let's talk a little about process. So the process in which we make the beer out of, we take that barley. Now barley or the malt is the same concept as a chicken's egg. When you have an egg, there's a shell that's protecting a genome that's surrounded by a little packet of nutrients that's going to feed the embryo as it grows to be whatever it's going to be. Yes?
Yes.
In the same way, in the barley is that seed, there's a shell on it. And I can't access what we call the pulp or that sugary stuff on the inside unless I crack open the shell. So down on deck one of this ship, I have a mill. And the purpose of that mill is not to pulverize the grain and make flour from it. I just want to crack it open the shell so I can access the sugary stuff. I then take what we call grist now, and we mix it with hot water. Does anybody know what the mixture of hot water and grain is called?
Mash.
Mash. So we're going to mix the mash in the first vegetable that we call the mash mixer, or the mash tun. Now, mash tun's a historical term, but a lot of times people call it mash tun or mash mixer. Now we're mixing the mash for a very important reason. The starches that are in the grain, the yeast cannot consume. So then, therefore, they can't create alcohol from it. So all of you guys, individually, I want you to imagine yourself as maltose molecules. You're all simple sugar maltose molecules. But you're all bound together in your little groups, these tables, by glycogen bonds. Yes?
Sure.
And so now you're all carbohydrates or starches. My yeast can't consume this entire table. But if I use time and temperature to activate an enzyme inside the grain called alpha amylase will come along and break this guy off, and this guy off, and this lady off, and you guys become fermentable sugars. The yeast can come along and consume you guys and then make alcohol out of you. The yeast can't consume you guys, so we refer to you guys as final gravity. That's the residual sweetness that balances the flavor of the beer. So you guys make alcohol, and you guys make sweetness. Cool? Questions, comments, concerns? So I just told you that I can create more or less alcohol by controlling the time and temperature, right? But I could also just add more grain, because more grain would equal more sugar equals more alcohol. Does that make sense to y'all? You ever heard of a Bock, like Shiner Bock? Yep. You ever heard of a Doppelbock? You ever heard of Belgian Triple? Yep. Double IPA? Yep. Belgian Quad? Imperial Stout? That's all those prefixes mean, is that those guys way back in like the 1600s, they didn't know all this cool science stuff about alpha amylase and fermentable sugars, but they did know if Sal, did I get that right? Wanted to make a higher ABV beer, he would just double his recipe, and so he called it a double Bock or a Doppelbock or a Belgian Triple. Cool? Awesome. So now we take the mash and we put it in the next vessel, which is called the lauter tun. Lauter tun is the same concept as your coffee maker at your house. When you make coffee, your goal is to put some grounds above a pot and then sprinkle water over the grounds and collect the juice from it, but not the solids from it, right? In the same way, I've got a bunch of solid grain inside a bunch of solid or liquid water. And I don't want the I don't want the solid grain, I want the liquid water. So I use the lauter tun to separate in the same way as your filter paper in the coffee maker. I separate all the solid grains out and I collect only the sugary water into the next vessel. Does anybody know what the sugary water is now called? Wort. So we pronounce it W-E-R-T. It's spelled W-O-R-T. That's because the German word for it is like Wurstenflurgen or something like that, and we just jacked up the translation, so we now call it wort. We're going to collect the wort into the boil kettle. Can you guess what we're going to do in the boil kettle? We're going to boil it. Now we're not boiling off the alcohol like in distilling, but what we're doing is we're boiling for three main reasons. The first reason, because at this point there's no alcohol. The first reason what we're going to do is we're going to isomerize alpha acid. Inside the hop, remember there's the alpha acid. The more alpha acid and the hotter you boil it, the more bitter the beer gets. So by boiling the beer longer, I get more alpha acid extraction out of the hop. Does that make sense to y'all? Yeah. You ever heard of Dogfish Head 60-minute IPA? Yep. You ever heard of 90-minute IPA? Yep. You ever heard of 120-minute IPA? Yep. They don't change the recipe of the beer. They just boil it for 60, 90, or 120 minutes, and therefore it gets more bitter because they're boiling it longer. Cool? Awesome. The second thing is we're getting rid of a chemical inside all cereal grain called DMS. That stands for dimethyl sulfide. It smells a little like cream corn or corn chips. Remember I told you guys to save a little bit of this beer? Smell it again. Yay! Hallelujah! Which one is this? This is going to be a okay. So, does anybody want more of the first beer?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, finish it off. And he's serving us.
That one though is maybe a little
Oh, really?
I'm gonna actually start this one over here. I'll just change the direction of it. I say that's fair, right?
We're in the middle either way.
Cigar City.
I'll talk about that. Not now, way back. All right, cool. So you guys smell that little bit of like, there's like a kind of a little bit of corn chip Frito kind of smell on the nose of the first beer that we had. You guys got that? That's the chemical I was referring to as DMS. DMS has a very corn chip or like Frito kind of smell, and we're gonna boil the beer in order to get rid of most of that DMS. Now, the reason I left a little bit of DMS in my beer in this beach lager is because beach lagers are very associated with the Caribbean. The Caribbean is usually associated with
Corona.
Latin food, Corona, tacos, corn chips. Beach lagers tend to have a little bit of corn in the recipe, and even though I don't use corn here on the ship, I try to leave some of the DMS inside the beer so that I get a little bit of that corn chip flavor out of it. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah. The second reason I'm boiling the beer is to, I told you we were going to isomerize alpha acid, we're going to get rid of DMS, and the third and final reason is that we got to, what? You guys have any guesses?
Pasteurize.
Say it again.
Pasteurize.
Say it again louder.
Pasteurize.
So what is pasteurization? It is sterilization, right? We're going to kill all the other microorganisms that might be floating around inside that solution of liquid. Because I don't know, as the brewer, how much bacteria or yeast or whatever is inside the boil kettle or in the pipes or in the water or on the grain or on my hands. So I've got to boil this thing so that I have total control of the microorganism that goes to the fermenter, so therefore I have total control of the way the beer tastes and smells. Does that make sense to y'all? Yeah. To illustrate this very fine point, the second beer that we're drinking today is a Saison. We ferment it using a Belgian Saison strain of yeast, and so you're going to get a little bit of like kind of Blue Moon-esque like smell from it, but then a little bit of like tartness on the mouth of it, because that Saison strain produces a little bit of lactic acid. Make sense? Yeah. Y'all can all see why we boil the beer now, yeah? Yeah. Cool. Any questions on the boil? So now we talk about mash, loud, or boil. The last phase of brewing is what we call the whirlpool. In the whirlpool, we whirl it around. Now, we're whirling around for really only one reason. I got rid of all the solid grains, right? But now I put a bunch of solid hops in there. Do I want solid stuff in my beer? You guys like chewing your beer? Most of the time, no. So, we whirl it around. We let it settle for 20 minutes. All the heavy stuff settles to the middle. We call it the true pile. The true pile is all that heavy, solid stuff that I don't want in the beer. The discharge port is on the side of the whirlpool. Therefore, when I send it into the fermenter, I don't collect any of that solid stuff. Does that make sense to y'all? Yeah. It's not rocket science, just regular science. Everybody cool? Awesome. So, here's your quiz. This is very important. Yay! Whichever direction you guys feel free to. Just make sure everybody gets something. Sound good? Cool. By the way, second beer, let's do Julie, cheers, prost, Nostrovia, ching ching, salut, all the good things, right? Cilantro.
What's the name of that second beer?
Farmhouse ale is actually what we call it, but we discontinued it. So
That's one so far.
I mean,
I'm not a beer
it's
drinker.
the lightest one. So
And that's
far.
it. I'm not a beer drinker.
Yeah,
But that one has no alcohol.
Yeah, we discontinued it mainly because we're trying to shoot for more American craft beer vibes and less like just regular beer vibes.
Which one? Like,
Yeah, it is.
What's the actual name of this one?
Farmhouse there.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Now, if you discontinue it, how are we drinking?
Huh?
If you discontinue it, how are we drinking?
Because I can brew whatever I want.
Can you brew me some more?
Well, I don't need to because it's already here. You're only here for a week, right?
Yeah.
All right, then you're good.
Okay.
I don't think you're going to drink the 16,000 liters that's in there. So, well, not 16,000. There's only about 1,600 liters there.
Jeff might.
So in the whirlpool, I told you guys we're separating this stuff. Now, here's the most important thing I want y'all to understand. Here's your quiz. Everything I just told you about, the mash, the louder, the boil, the whirlpool, we refer to that as hot side. We call it hot because it's
Hot.
Now, on the fermentation side, it's going to become cold. So therefore, we refer to it as cold side. All right, there's yeast on the cold side. You guys are the yeast. Y'all the yeast, cool? You guys are the hot side. If I put boiling hot stuff on top of the yeast, what happens to the yeast? They're gonna die, yes? If I kill the...
Good afternoon. This announcement is for Dondria McCutcheon and Darren Gary. Dondria McCutcheon, Darren Gary, kindly contact guest services located on Deck 8 aft or dial extension 7777. Thank
Anybody need
you.
to borrow my phone?
Whoop. We
got to do that. Alright, so if I put the boiling stuff on top of the yeast, what happens to the yeast? They die, right? If I kill the yeast can't produce what? Alcohol. Without alcohol, beer kind of sucks, yes or no?
Yes.
So it's very important that I don't kill the yeast, right? So in between the hot side and the cold side is a very important piece of equipment. I would argue one of the most important pieces of equipment in the whole brewery. And we call this thing the heat exchanger. The heat exchanger is the same concept as the radiator in your car. There's a bunch of really thin plates that are stacked really close to one another. We run a cold medium over one side of the plates. We run a hot medium over the other side of the plates. We exchange the heat between the two mediums. Therefore, the hot stuff leaves cold and the cold stuff leaves hot. The important thing about this is that the cooled down wort is now sterile, because if I don't cool it down sterilely, it's susceptible to be re-inoculated with any microbes that happen to be around. This is where a lot of homebrew guys will screw up, because they're going to take their Mr. Beer kit that they got for Father's Day from Brooks and Mahan in 1994, and they're going to boil it and whatever means they have available to them, which for most guys, that's their grill on their back porch. And they're going to follow all the steps that they can as closely as they can from that little book that comes in there. But when it comes to cooling it down, it's going to say cool it down as fast as you possibly can. And the only way that they have to cool it down at home is to either soak it in an ice bath in the kitchen sink or in the bathtub, or make some kind of janky copper coal. What are you looking for?
Did
they get some down
They got them, yeah.
They got it.
Sorry, just take
We're
it.
working that
I
way.
think that's the third one. Are we at?
Is this the third?
No, that's the first.
This is the first.
That's the second picture of the first. So that doesn't cool it down sterilely, right? And so now your toasted amber ale comes out like sour amber ale. Nobody wants that. So all mine's free and clear so far. All right. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go inside and look at some of my Nito equipment. Now, there's a couple of very important things that I need you all to hear during this portion of the tour. You ready? Well, I gotcha.
Yep.
1, 2, 3, eyes on me. These are very important PSAs. Listen, that's it. I'm going to take that here picture. Alright, so, PSA. First, this is a drinking tour. If you guys need to go to the bathroom on our way inside, you're welcome to use that bathroom in the back corner of the restaurant. Second thing, this is a drinking tour. If you guys want to bring your beers with you, you're more than welcome to do so. Third thing, this is the important one. If you guys, you're about to go into a real actual functioning brewery. There might be water on the floor. There might be hoses on the floor. I want you to mind your step because I know you're on vacation. You've probably been drinking all day. If it comes between you guys falling over and busting your head or grabbing onto a tank, I would rather you what? Fall.
Oh.
No, grab onto a tank. So, I just told you not to fall, yes or no?
Yes.
So if you fall, is it my problem?
No.
Thank you, Jesus. Hallelujah. All right, let's go inside. Let's go inside. Oh, yeah, you guys are hot? You guys can stay here just 1 second. This is why I talk to my mommy on the phone. It does feel good. What's up, big dog?
All good?
How are you, man?
Good, good. So you're here just brewing the beer, like your assistant works for Carnival, but you still work for the main company, right?
I mean,
You're working for Brew.
nope, I work for Carnival.
Oh, you work directly for Carnival now?
Yeah. My paycheck comes
From Carnival.
But he has the coolest job.
What's up,
on the
little
ship.
guy?
I mean, it's only you and the piano people that can drink while they're working.
I mean, it's only me and the piano people that are supposed to drink.
Yes.
Can and supposed
You're right.
You don't know if it's good unless you taste it.
Hello. How you doing, buddy?
Security's never going to breathalyze the brewmaster.
That's not true. All right, guys, we're gonna make like a little half circle around here. If you want, you can sit there right
Yeah.
there, right here.
Surround
Yeah.
the pig.
Whatever makes your heart happy, buddy.
Yep.
Yay! Come on in. The water's fine. Yeah, yeah, yeah. How you doing, buddy? Good. Who's this guy? I like
He makes sure nobody goes thirsty.
Yeah, he makes sure.
you. Anybody? You're me on the group. If I was a guest and taking a tour, that would be. I mean, almost like the only thing he's missing is the beer. I'd be wearing a hat. I'd be wearing a tank top, shorts, and probably hey dude. 9 times out of 10, I've got hey dude done.
You owe me $30.
What?
I need that green cell cycle. We'll talk about it. I get off at 10.
Come on. Am I missing anybody?
No, I think we were the last.
Okay, great. Is anybody in your parties here?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So this is what we call our brew house. Now we obviously don't call it the brew house because it's in a separate house. But historically speaking, this would be in a separate house. So therefore, it was called a brew house. That's because back in I told you guys we've been making beer for a very long time, right? Humans have. And so like the 1600s back in England, imagine you live in a hut and has a thatched roof. Do you want boiling hot stuff and fire and stuff inside your house? No. So they put it in a separate house. They called it the brew house because that's where they brew. That's also why they call it the outhouse. Back in the day, they didn't have indoor plumbing. You didn't really want to poop a caca pee pee where you eat. Remember that old saying? You never
Shit where he's leaving.
yeah. Dude, y'all gotta hear this. A couple weeks ago, I accidentally, I was trying to say you never shit where you eat, but I blurted out eat instead of shit. So I was like, so yeah, you never shit where you, and I felt like a total idiot. Anyway, but yeah, that's why they call it the outhouse, and that's also why they call it the brew house, because you don't want that stuff inside your house. We just keep calling it the brew house because we're lazy and we don't like to change what we call stuff. But we also refer to it sometimes as a brew deck. That's because it's always lifted up on a platform like this. It's not because I need a stage to perform from. It's all the engineering that helps me move this liquid around. The pumps, the pipes, the hoses, all that stuff is located under this deck. Now there's a couple of very unique things about this particular brew house, other than the fact that it's on a cruise ship. Can you guys guess maybe the most obvious thing? Huh? Say it again. Clear. They're made out of glass. There's only about 7 in the world that are made out of glass. They're custom made for us by a company in Munich, Germany called Albrecht Brewtechnik. And there's really absolutely no good reason for it to be made out of glass. Every brewery in the world, almost every brewery in the world, is made out of stainless steel. That's because stainless steel is a whole lot more cost effective than this super thick tempered glass. But super thick tempered glass is really cool. And Carnival likes cool stuff. So we bought a cool brewery to put on our cool ship so that our guests would say, oh wow, that's cool. Yay! Now, it doesn't affect the beer one way or the other, whether it's clear or not at this stage of the game. Because at this stage of the game, I'm only extracting the sugar, taking away the malt, and then adding the hops. Does that make sense to you guys? It's very important that light strike doesn't happen on the fermentation side, but on the hop side, on the brewing side, it doesn't make any difference at all. It just makes it a really cool attraction. But what I want y'all to understand is, where are you from? Where are you from? And where are you from?
Florida.
Okay, so the breweries that you guys are familiar with, so we got like North Atlantic, Mid-Atlantic, South Atlantic. The breweries that you guys are familiar with, you ever seen a glass brew house? Now, the reason for that is most guys on land, their business model, the way they make money, their profit margin is derived from this. Yes or no?
Yes.
If you open a brewery and your liquid's not making you money, I assure you, you're in big trouble. Yeah? Here at Carnival Cruise Lines, I've already made my money. You tracking?
Yeah.
Picking up what I'm putting down? What I want you to understand is that my business model is just different than every other brewery. I do want to make good, profitable beer. That's not my bottom line. My bottom line is to make a cool attraction that people want to come and see. That's why we invested in this cool brew house, and that's also why you're not going to see a cool brew house at your local brewery, because the attraction's not what they're there for. The liquid's what they're there for. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah. Also, there's another very unique thing about this particular brewery. Do you guys remember how many processes we talked about outside? 4. Mash, lauter, boil, whirlpool. Yes?
Yes.
How many vessels do you see right here? 2. So we combined the 4 processes into 2 vessels. That took a lot of practice. Y'all give me some love. Hey, dexterity, baby. So that's because I'm on a cruise ship, but I got a bunch of space to put a bunch of stuff. So I combined the 4 processes into 2 vessels. This is the mash, boil, lauter, whirlpool. So when I make beer here, probably every day this cruise. So if y'all want to come and see it in action, anytime tomorrow, it takes about 6 to 8 hours to make. So anytime tomorrow, anytime San Juan, or anytime St. Martin, you guys can come through
You want to say Martin?
Oh, it's St. Thomas, I'm sorry. We were St. Martin last week. St. Thomas. Hey, y'all guys can come through anytime and you'll see this working. So this is where the grain gets mixed with the water. We make mash. I then transfer it over here. This is now the lauter type. If you'll see in the bottom, it's a flat stainless steel bottom. And if you look real close, there's a bunch of small like holes in the bottom. That acts like the filter paper and allows me to sift away all the solid grain and collect only the sugar water back over here. I then boil that sugar water. You see the can in the middle? That can is called a calandria. The calandria has a steam jacket that runs in the side, and it works just like an old percolator, an old coffee maker. The liquid comes inside, it gets real hot, it shoots up out of the top, and then we're rolling our boil the entire time. That way I'm not caramelizing any additional sugars, and I'm not changing the flavor or the color of the beer. Cool? Cool. I'm then going to shoot the liquid back over here. What do you think I did with all the grain that was in there? Dumped it where? What happens to it on land? Anybody know?
Animal feed.
Animal feed. Cows, pigs. You see any cows? No. So, obviously on the ship, I can't dispose of it the same way I do on land. What we do with it here is I get rid of it in USDA approved solid food waste bins. I dump it down into the galley, and then I get rid of it back when we get to Miami. What happens to it from there?
Who
not
cares?
my grain, not my problem. But most of the time from there, it's converted to ferment, and the cows don't discriminate between fermented and non-fermented grain. And as some of you may know, they have like 17 stomachs or something, and so then they get bloated, and you can kill cows from that. So we usually just send it to a landfill, but it's purely organic material, so it doesn't matter anymore. Sound good?
Yes.
What's your question?
How many pounds of grains do you go through? What do you do a brew day?
So here, do you guys remember who made my system? What system? What country made my? Germany. What system for measurement do they use in Germany? What system do we use? Standard. We have the audacity to call it standard when the rest of the world uses metric, and it's literally the opposite of standard. How do you like that? So I'm not using pounds, I'm using kilos, but the grain bags do come in pounds and kilos. I mean, I'm using, let's say for beef slaughter, somewhere around 150, 200 kilos. This is an 800 liter system, but I double batch it into each one of the fermenters.
Now, do you sell it off the ship or do you keep it all here?
No. Anybody know why I don't sell it off the ship?
Because you don't have a license to.
No.
So you drink it all here?
What?
Taxes.
What?
Taxes.
Taxes. So taxes in the U.S. as far as alcohol is concerned is based off distribution. And because I don't distribute anywhere in the United States, I don't get taxed based on my distribution. Where are we now?
International water.
I have no idea either. So, yeah, they can't tax me because I don't distribute anywhere on there.
You don't even give it to other countries, like you don't drop it off or
Nope.
give it to other ships
Nope.
or
Only here.
only here.
The beer you get here, you can only get here. So I'm sorry if I make one that's your absolute favorite. So now, there's one last very unique thing I want to talk about here. Anybody have a guess? You guys see those stacks going out the top? Those are there just for show. Every brewery in the whole wide world has to ventilate their steam. And the way they ventilate their steam is through stacks going through the roof, because that's the easiest way to do it, right? But I'm on a cruise ship, remember? What deck are we on now?
8.
What deck is that? What's on deck 9?
Staterooms.
Only staterooms. Can I ventilate my steam through people's staterooms? Nope.
Do it.
I guarantee you, that's a real bad idea. So, because I'm on a cruise ship, I have to use slightly different engineering to get rid of my steam. The pipes going out the back are actually an activated ventilation system. It's always sucking air through the kettles and out the stacks in the top. It's just taking a different route to get there because I have to force it to go there. I can't naturally ventilate because of the construction of the ship. Any other questions? Cool, let's go in there and look at some of my other neato stuff.
So does Carnival have a patent on this system, or?
No.
Okay, so anybody could build something like this. It's just ridiculously expensive.
Yeah. Just go that way first.
In and okay.
No, that way. Right.
Oh, sorry.
And then circle.
I didn't see there was a that way.
Don't grip, watch your step.
Hold on to the stainless.
Don't grip, watch your step. Don't grip.
Am I stopping here? I guess. There's nothing but an open door.
Maybe we just circle back around.
I mean, I can close the door. Are we coming all the way around? I'm confused. I mean, yeah, maybe. Who knows? Are we circling all the way around? I'm confused. Okay. The door was open. That's why I was like, what?
Yeah, keep coming, keep coming.
Oh, keep coming. Okay.
Just, you can close that door all the way. Cool. Come, and then you guys can circle this way.
We're trying to ask a bunch of stupid questions.
Come. You guys can kind of pack in there a little bit if you want. You can come in some more. Y'all aren't afraid to be friends, right? No. We're all drinking beer anyway. It's all good. This is the only way I figured out how to get everybody in this room, because the first couple of tours when we opened this class of ship, they all just came like straight in, and then everybody like just dead-ended at the door, and like, where do we go from there? So the easiest easiest way to do is like get everybody to go around, and then we can all kind of come back together. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. Everybody can see and hear and all that jazz? Right on. So this is what we call the cellar. Now, just like with the brew house, we don't call it the cellar because it's in a cellar. But historically speaking, the temperature control during fermentation is probably the most important thing during fermentation. So the only way they had to control temperature, at least relatively back in the day, was to put it in the earth and use the earth to insulate it, and therefore they call it the cellar. And we're lazy and we don't like to change what we call stuff, so we still call it the cellar. Actually, most of the breweries will still call the people that work in this room cellarmen, because they've been known as cellarmen for many, many, many years. So sometimes they're also referred to as the fermentation hall, because what's happening here is fermentation. Usually they're shaped sort of like a hall. Now everything you're seeing in front of you, all these tanks, these are all double jacketed stainless steel tanks. Think of them kind of like really expensive giant Yeti cups. So you have two jackets. The inside jacket you can see here at the top of the dome, and then it comes down and it meets this gap, and that's where the second jacket starts. These pipes here are running a substance called propylene glycol into these jackets. Now that propylene glycol is coming into this room from the engines, that's what's cooling the engines, at like negative 30 degrees Celsius. It's super, super cold. The reason we're doing that is what's going to happen is the sugar water that I produce outside is going to come into this room. It's going to run through that heat exchanger behind you. It's going to come in boiling right here and exit that pipe right behind this gentleman at like 66 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to pump it into one of these tanks using one of these hoses. That sugar water is then going to be introduced to yeast inside one of these tanks. The yeast is going to then start to consume the sugar. And just like all of you, when they start to eat, they get really excited. Yes or no? You ever given yourself the meat sweats? That's what's happening here. These yeast, they just start eating, yum, 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 yum. They get really excited, and they start producing kinetic energy the same way your body does when you eat a lot. And so therefore, I set the red numbers on the front of the tanks. These are all fermentation temperatures. So I set the thermostat basically to the fermentation temp, or at least the high end of it. So we'll say I set it to 20 degrees Celsius, because remember, this is German, and they do metrics, because metrics makes it, yeah, cool. So I set it to 20 degrees Celsius. That's like 66, well, it's like 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So I set it to 20 degrees Celsius. When the yeast heat the tank up to, let's say, 20.1 degrees Celsius, the automatic glycol valve on one of these lines up there flashes that super cold glycol into the jacket of the tank. That basically tells all the yeast inside to, hey, calm down. And they say, okay. And they sink back down to the bottom of the tank. Then they start to eat again. And say, hey, Chica, take it easy. All right? It's okay. And so we're controlling the action of the yeast based on the temperature of the tank. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm sure all of you at some point this cruise have seen someone on Lido that could use a glycol valve. Hey, 15 trips, man. It's a little early. It's day one of the cruise, man. Take it easy. So we're just controlling the action of the yeast based on the temperature of the tank. When the fermentation is complete, I'm going to then crash the tank to just above freezing. Now I know when fermentation is complete because I'm going to measure what we call the specific gravity every day until I see it some kind of change. Now, the specific gravity is the measurement of a solid that's dissolved in the solution of a liquid. In our case, that would be sugar. Yes or no? Yes. So I'm going to measure the specific gravity every day. The yeast are going to eat the sugar. They're going to ferment it down. It's going to start at like 10, then maybe 9, then maybe 7, then 6.5. And once it repeats itself, that indicates to me that all the fermentable sugar that I created in the mash has been consumed by the yeast. So therefore, they can't consume any more sugar because they're non-fermentable sugars. Once the yeast can't eat anymore, they begin to die. If I kill the yeast, they produce off flavors. We call them off flavors because they're off. We don't like off flavors, yes or no? So I then crash the tank to just above freezing. What that does is it forces all the solids, any yeast, any hops, all that stuff down into the bottom of the cone. That's why we call these conical fermenters, because they have cones at the bottom. I can use the geometry of said cone to then dump the yeast down the drain or harvest the yeast into the next tank if I see fit. I do like to reharvest my yeast. That's because yeast are living organisms. Just like people, how many of you guys have kids? Were your kids good at being human beings when they were babies? No. If you leave your kid in the woods and leave it alone, is it going to live without you? No. Now, the same way, yeast will make beer, but they don't make it real well on first gen. Sometimes they make off flavor, sometimes they take a little longer. But then Gen 2, maybe Gen 3, that when I say Gen, I mean new beer, new beer, new beer. Maybe they're now in their mid-30s, they're doing brewery tours on a cruise ship, they kind of got their shit together now, and eventually they start doing weird old people stuff. We say thanks for your service, ciao, bye, enjoy your time. Cool?
Right.
Now, it's not exactly linear like I just explained. It's not the same yeast cell that gets more mature and does things better. It's actually quite interesting. It's evolution in real time. Good genetic traits get passed on to the next generation and the next generation, and eventually, you guys ever made a copy of a copy? Yeah. You ever made a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy? And eventually that starts to fade. The same thing happens when cells reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. The telomeres at the end of the genome start fading, and then you get weird stuff starting to happen whenever it's not supposed to happen. For instance, the lager strain that goes into this beer starts making Hefeweizen type of flavors, and I don't want that to happen because that's not what we call true to brand. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. So then all of these tanks here in this ship, another very unique thing about this particular brewery is that all of these tanks are connected directly to the taps outside. So these are what we call serving vessels and fermentation vessels, which is why, can I hold your beer? Sure. How many of you guys know a lot about beer? You, obviously, and all right, so are lagers supposed to have haze?
No.
Does that have haze?
Yes.
Why does it have haze?
Because we're not straight out of the...
These are serving vessels. What kind of vessel is my serving vessel located on?
So this is
A ship. I told you I use the geometry of the cone in cold time to drop solids out of solution, right?
Yes.
So it's all down in the bottom of that cone. When the ship starts a-rocking, it gets kicked back up, right? And because I don't use any kind of filter or anything like that, it just sometimes comes out into the glass. And this is why sometimes, maybe today you get a hazy one, but then Thursday, if we have like smooth sand and we're like parked at docks all day, this might be clear as the day is long. It's just because of the way the ship moves. Does that make sense to y'all? Now, Carnival did provide me with that thing behind that guy, which is called a lenticular filter. Now, the reason I don't use that lenticular filter is because lenticular filters, there's several ways to filter beer. The easiest way is time and temperature. Like I just described to you guys, I just use temperature and time to drop everything out. Eventually, it'll be super clear. And that works really well on land, stable ground, unless you're in California. Or Africa at the moment. Yeah, y'all seen that crap? Jesus. Anyway, we'll get there later. But the other way is you can use centrifuge. That's probably the safest way. You spin all the solids out of solution. Or you can use a diatomaceous earth filter, or a DE filter. That separates almost everything. You can even remove color out of diatomaceous. Hey! You can even remove color out of that. But most people, like especially small breweries, the cheapest way to do it is use something called a lenticular or a plate and frame filter. Now the problem with these guys though is that inside that dome you see, there's a bunch of like paper filters just like a coffee maker. And the only way to sterilize those filters is either steam bathe them or put them in a citric acid bath for several days. Where am I again? On a ship. Where am I going to put citric acid baths?
nowhere.
Would y'all
spa?
No. Negatory March. The reason is they don't communicate with me when we're building new ships. They communicate with my boss. My boss is not a brewer. So when a German say, "Hey man, we gotta wait for you guys to make like clear beer all the time," he's like, "Yeah, who cares? I got a Carnival checkbook. Let's do it." Listen, if I'm lying, I'm dying. That's just the way it goes. But last couple of things I want to mention in this room. I told you guys that's the heat exchanger. Another very unique thing about this particular brewery, for anybody who knows anything about brewing, a lot of times breweries are confined to their capacity based on how much water that they can produce at the temperature that they need. One of the luxuries I have here on the ship is I don't have a limited source of whatever temperature water I want. I have on-demand hot water in this cabinet. So if I set the water out there on that computer to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to give me 190 degree Fahrenheit water for as long as I want. So don't turn on that hot water valve.
Right.
Burn the ever-living hell out of it. Yes, ma'am.
Have you thought about using ocean therapy to do the fermenting? The sounds of the ocean waves? Because sounds have been a new thing for brewers to be able to use to help ferment.
I will start playing some ocean sounds.
You need to get the Germans to call and tell them to do that.
It's a variation of music. You do different music depending on what you want to distill. It comes out. That's just something I've learned.
No, I'll read it. I'll read some. I've never even heard of it. That's cool.
Drink some ocean.
This here, behind that, this is exactly what it says, chemical locker. There's a bunch of really noxious chemicals in there that will eat your face off, so don't open it up. Now, the reason I mention that is most brewers, this guy, and who was my other brewer? Here. What is the majority of brewing? Cleaning. 99% of my job is making sure things on this side is sterile. What we're using to do that are those chemicals. The first method that we use is an alkaline cleaner that removes any organic matter. It denatures proteins. It's a strong alkaline. So don't touch that. The second thing we use is a phosphoric acid. It's food grade. The reason we use that is so that we can remove mineral deposit. I told you guys I add minerals back into the mash so I can create the mineral profile that I want. Think about your bathtub. Like the phosphoric acid is like super strong CLR. It takes all of that mineral deposit off the inside of the tanks. The third thing that I'm using is something called peroxytic acid, or we refer to it as PAA. That's our sterilizing solution. We don't use bleach because bleach will kill you. We don't want to kill you if you accidentally drink some of the bleach. But PAA, if you take it in small enough doses, will just give you a little tum-tum ache. So we use that to sterilize the inside of the tank rather than bleach. Make sense? Also on the lines of killing people.
Let's not.
Most of the time, we explained science to me through the lens of beer when I was like 13. I would have been like, holy shit, this is cool, and I would have paid way more attention. So I encourage, like, bring the kids, man. It's fun, dude. It's cool. Any other questions for me? Cool, let's go outside and drink more beer. Yay!
Yeah.